but I really just so appreciate playing the song "In Christ Alone." Those three words say it all, don't they? I've got a counselor friend of mine. She and I were at Exchange Life Ministries together in Dallas, and she's now, that was several years ago, and so she's now about 75. And she's my counselor, okay? And so I call her up when when Paige gets started my whining, she says, "Call Perry." So I get on the phone and I call Perry, and I'll never forget this one call, and God's used Perry to help me a lot, and she's got an incredible gift of discernment. And so I just went on and on and on, and I was moaning and I was whining, and I just went on and on, and she finally, after about 10 minutes, I finally, stopped. And she just, was very quiet. And this was her response. Now, I'm hurting here, okay? And she said, "Apparently, Jesus is not enough." And that was the end of the call. So I think that's why I appreciate the song, "In Christ Alone." And here in the power of Christ, I will stand. Isn't that what we're talking about? Okay. So tonight, we're going to talk about what is God's part and man's part in the transformation process in session 3, and then we're going to get into actual application. But I want to lay a little bit more groundwork because I'm going to look at what is God's part in living in you. We talked a little bit about this morning, that God is your initiator. He began the good work in you. When did that happen, folks? Okay, salvation. He began the work at salvation. Now, you could say he actually began the work in eternity past, drawing you, but just for the sake of argument, we'll say that he began it at salvation. And look at how the rest of this verse goes. He who began a good work in you will perfect it to the day of Christ Jesus. So not only is he the initiator, he's the cause and effect of transformation. Did we do it? Oh, yeah. Hallelujah. There is a God. A&M one. Okay. I tell you, you married up, brother. That's all I can tell you. Anybody, an Alabama fan that's going to root for A&M, well, of course, Rosemary, she's got a split deal. You got kiddos that are Aggies, and she's tried to convert some of those kiddos to Alabamians and hadn't worked out. But anyway, all right. But look at this verse for just a second. You know what the key word is in this verse is will. Now, I don't know about you, but people come to me all the time and they say, "Bill, God's able but not willing." Well, let me tell you what. This word tells me you have the determined God of the universe in you who will do it. The only unwilling party is who? Us. "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." He's knocking to get in. He says, "Are you going to let me in? Because I'm going to keep knocking." He's knocking for the rest of you. Whether you ever, and I'm not talking about salvation now, I'm talking about to bring him in to transform your life. He is going to knock until your last breath. You can say no, but I'm telling you what, he's knocking. He wants to get in. Think about this. Right now, you have the determined God of the universe who's waiting to break into your soul and change how you think, feel, choose, and behave. He is willing. All right, so here's your pop quiz for tonight. Remember this verse from this morning? See, I want to just see if you have a memory. Commit your way. Why are we committing our way? Come on, no mumbling. Why do we commit our way? Will our way work? No, that's why we do it. So we're giving it to him. We're trusting also in him, and he's going to do what? Do it. All right. Do you know what that it is in your life that needs to be done, and yet the truth is you can't handle it, fix it, solve it, overcome it? We commit our way to the way. We trust also in him. And what does he promise as the cause and effect of transformation? He is going to do it. Now, what will God do? God will, now listen to this, he will produce victory. He will produce freedom. He will produce healing. He will supply. And he will transform your life. Because I was so steeped in bondage to anxiety and fear and inadequacy, and I drank to kind of assuage some of that, and some other things that I did because they were the medication of the choice, because I was told it was up to me, and as I continually failed in that, you see, at some point you're thinking, why am I, I was insane. I was an insane Christian. for 25 years because I kept repeating the same activity over and over again and nothing changed. And it got worse. And that last 10 years of that 30, Paige and I were married. And here we are. Her father was a very angry, abusive alcoholic. Can't even call him dad because he was a non-person in their lives. He was in the Air Force. How he ended up getting a medical discharge, died at 53 of cirrhosis of the liver. But he would just come home drunk. And she can't remember any touching, holding, any of that from her dad. And so I've kind of told you about my dad and bring her dad into this. So here we are. The moment we said I do, we had no idea because I had needs. She had needs. I wanted to be unconditionally loved. I got married because I was going to be unconditionally loved. Guess what she wanted? Unconditional love. She wanted unconditional acceptance and value and worth. And so guess what? Two takers got married. You know, in Bernie, we call that 2 ticks and no dog. Now think about that, if you got to think about that just a little bit. Doesn't play well in New York, but I hoped in San Antonio that this would kind of play well, that here we are, 2 empty cups trying to extract from one another. And now here again, we were both believers. And did we not have the fullness of Christ's unconditional love in us? Absolutely, and the fullness of acceptance and value. But instead of being a giver, we were trying to take, and it's 2 empty cups trying to get life from one another. It didn't work. But as God began to transform, and as we get into part 4, we'll show you more practically what that looks like. But all I can tell you is, everything on this is true. He will do it. But you have a part to play in that. And so let's look at your part for just a second. And I think it's kind of summed up in John 15:5. Jesus says, I'm the vine and you're the branches. You got that? Somebody says there's one vine and 6 billion wannabes. You want to be God? Well, every time we go independent, take control, then we become God. All right? So he says, he who abides in me and I in him, he bears much fruit. And you know, I was taught that the word bear means to produce. Interesting. Well, if it does, then who's it up to produce it? Well, see, it's up to me. I was told I've got to go out, and here's the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, right? I didn't love Paige enough, so I had to produce more love. I had to do these things. The word bear means to hold. That branch simply holds the fruit. It doesn't produce it. What's the source of the fruit? The vine. The vine is the source of the fruit. So what's happening, let me just give you a few words for abide. All right, just 4 words I want to just give you tonight. Remain, draw from, depend on, and live from. Because what happens when that branch is separated from the vine? What happens to the branch? It dies. And how much fruit can be produced from a dead vine? You see, if you and I live independent of God, there will be no fruit, there will be no life. In other words, He cannot do work in you or through you. But here's the good news, you don't produce the fruit. It's the Spirit, it's the life of Christ through that branch that produces the fruit. Now, doesn't that kind of take you off the hook? But you do have this part, if you don't remain, if you don't draw from, if you don't depend on, and you don't live from, nothing changes. Now, I don't know, have y'all been to a vineyard before? Anybody been to a vineyard? Okay, what did you hear when you walked through the vineyard? Did you hear those branches moaning and struggling to stay on the vine? Wasn't it just simply abiding and resting in the vine? Well, let's talk a little bit more about our part, because I would define it basically as your part in allowing for Christ to live in and through you is depend on, rely on, and draw from the life and power of Christ within you. You can't live it, right? You can't produce it, right? And so what is he saying? And it's the same thing going back to our surgical analogy. Your part is to get on the table and allow God to do this work. But I want to tie this in to Christ, because Christ was not only the God-man, He was man-God. And we don't talk much about that man God, the man part of God, of Jesus, but let's look at this, and I want to start with Philippians 2, 6, and 7, which says, He, Jesus, had equal status with God, but didn't think him so much of himself that he had to cling to the advantages of that status no matter what. Not at all. When the time came, he did what? He set aside the privileges of deity and took on the status of a slave. He became human. In other words, at no time was he not God, but he set aside his omnipotence, his omniscience, everything that he did, he set that aside. Now the question is, why did he choose to do that? Well, let's look at 3 verses in John, because this is Jesus' earthly relationship with the Father. In John 5:19, it says, Jesus therefore answered and was saying to him, Truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do what? Did you hear that? Now, can't the Son do everything? He could, but what did he do? He set aside that privilege, and he chose to do nothing of himself. So was Jesus initiating anything? Was he the cause and effect of anything? All right, let's look at John 5:30. I can do how much on my own initiative? You see, this is the man God. This is the man Jesus saying, as I hear, I judge, my judgment is just. John 8:28. Jesus therefore said, when you lift up the Son of Man, then you'll know that I'm He, and I do what? Nothing of my own initiative. So here's another question. Who raised Lazarus from the dead? Who healed the blind man? Well, we want to say it was Jesus, but I want you to look at John 14:10. It says, Don't you believe that I'm in the Father and the Father's in me? The words I say are not my own, but my Father who lives in me does what, folks? So who raised Lazarus from the dead? The Father, through the Son, did the work. Father, through the Son, gave sight to the blind. So do you get that? But didn't Jesus have a part to play? He participated. And what was his part? What was his part with the Father to make this happen? Y'all are just mumblers. Come on. What was Jesus' part? Participate. His part was to participate. Father, I'm trusting you to give sight to the blind. Father, I'm trusting you to raise Lazarus from the dead. Father, I'm trusting you to heal the man of the pool of Bethesda. It wasn't Jesus doing it. He was participating with the life and power of the Father through him to do it. Now let me tell you why that is crucial. Because it brings us to a question. If Jesus lived in total dependence on his Father's life and power, how should we live? Exactly the same way. Totally dependent. 100% dependent. But I'm telling you what, we struggle with this word dependence. As I was telling you, I worked with these guys in Curry Creek Baptist and Bernie, and I'm not picking on Curry Creek because I see it everywhere. This word dependence is hard. And there are 3 reasons that I want to just share with you, because the world says what? Be independent. And what does it say? You can do it. You better do it. You need to do it. It just needs to be done. All right? But for us men, and I just want to talk to the men for just a second, when we see the word dependence, somehow that's translated into what? In the world's viewpoint. Weakness. If I'm dependent, I am weak. I want to go back to Paul for just a second. Would you say that Paul, in and of himself, was pretty strong, capable, and probably strong-willed, a lot of self-discipline? And yet, what does he say? In 1 Corinthians 12, he says, I glory in my strengths. I glory in my weaknesses. Because his power is perfected in my weakness. So when I go to a men's retreat, I say, okay, guys, I got a room full of men, right? All right? And I says, okay, guys, how many of you want to embrace these 3 words? Helpless, weak, and needy. And I've got both hands up. And they're looking around, where did you get this speaker? I want the speaker that's going to tell me how to get victory and freedom. But you see, Paul embraced that, because doesn't the word, by the very definition, dependence, means that I'm helpless, weak, and needy? And what is Satan? If I'm Satan, the false gospel is, you better do it. You can do it. Oh, by the way, if you'll try to do it, God will help you. Who do you think perpetuated this God help you theology? I think Satan was dead center in the middle of it. That's right. That's right. You know, and the question is how long are you going to be insane? How many years are you going to be insane? Keep repeating the same activity over and over. God help me, God help me, God help me. And all of a sudden you finally wake up. It only took me 25 years. I'm a little slow. You guys are a lot faster than I am, okay? Let's come to the point tonight that dependence is weakness, which is a lie. And then the flesh, obviously the flesh within us says I can live independent of God. Well, what happens? Jesus says, apart from me, you can do what? Basically, living independent of God is going to result in no transformation. I say things might get worse. I think things will get worse. You know, if we live independent of God, I was hardening my heart towards God. Do you realize that? I mean, I would click in. It wasn't saying for 30 years I was living independent of God. I know every once in a while it's kind of like a blind hog finds an acorn every once in a while. Well, I think I found dependence periodically, and that's how it was. But Jesus says, apart from me, you can do nothing. So this is what I can promise you. If you choose to live independent of God, there's going to be no power over sin. There's going to be no victory over the flesh. There's going to be no freedom from your defeating sin patterns. There's going to be no healing of woundedness. There's going to be no supply, and there certainly will be no intimacy with God. Could y'all just let that sift in your soul for just a moment? If you choose to live independent as a renegade branch, trying to produce this fruit, nothing happens. And yet, the gospel I heard was the performance gospel, and what they were really saying is, live independent of God. Now, they didn't say it that way. They basically said, you do it, and God will help you. And the truth is, I was living independent of God. So, that's why God is in the process in every area of your life of bringing you to the place of what? I can't. Why would God bring us to the place of I can't in the situations that we face and the struggles? Why would He do that? Okay. Absolutely. He says, I can't is the place of where you've reached the end of your resources. Do you remember in 1998 when here was the question, are you done yet? Was I done? I was done. I reached the end of my resources. At that point, I turned to God and realized that He was my source. He was my life. But you see, this is where God's bringing us to the place, because the question is, if your design was to be dependent, how often should you be dependent? Every moment of every day. Your life never works independent. So you remember some of the I can'ts that I couldn't living a life? Well, these are the places. So why is this good news if we come to this place, if I can't stop sinning and I can't transform myself? Why is that good news? Why is that music to the Lord's ears? Okay, you finally come to the place that I can't do God's job. I can't be God. God's not going to help me be God. And so the greatest thing that God is bringing us to, and I'm telling you what, when I'm in a counseling session and they finally say, I can't do it, I say, hallelujah, because you were never intended to. They're trying to fix their marriage. You know what's interesting in marriage counseling? I come in and I look at the husband and he looks at me and I said, what's the problem? He said, she's the problem. And then I turned to the wife and I said, well, what's the problem? Well, he's the problem. And you know what they're saying? If you can get my spouse fixed, I'm going to be okay. That is a lie. It's a lie. Because if you've got two takers in a marriage, who gives? And yet, if I'm living from Christ totally, how often am I going to give and give and give? You know, the only reason our marriage survived, we just celebrated our 26th anniversary, is because we finally came to the place of I can't meet my wife's needs, and she cannot meet mine. And as we began to participate and said, Lord, you know, you meet that need of love and unconditional acceptance and worth and value, things began to change because we both started moving from takers to givers. And you know, ultimately where God will take us if we're living totally from Christ, We will be totally others-focused. I'm in a counseling session here again, and I asked this question. Now, these people are on the edge of divorce, right? They're standing on the edge of the cliff, and their next step is they're going down. And I asked them this question. Blows their mind every time. What would be different about your marriage if you were both totally others-focused? Now, you know when they come to me, you know who it's about, don't you? They are totally self-focused, totally selfish. It's totally about them, and they're wanting you to get their spouse fixed so everything will be fine. And yet they just look at me like that deer in the headlight. What do you mean others-focused? Just for those of you that are married, I want you to think about what your marriage would be like if you were both for the other person. Well, we can't produce that, but God certainly can. So when Paul says, I can't, when he says in Galatians 2:20, I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. I tell you what, I want to start breathing right now. This is good news. I love the fact that I can't do it. I embrace the fact that I can't do it. There's something within me that says that I can, and we'll talk about that in the last session. But another word for dependence is faith. Now, is there not anybody, you all know it's a walk of faith, right? This is not new news. We see it in Galatians 2:20, the rest of it, when he says, I've been crucified with Christ. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. In the life which I now live in the flesh, which is he's talking about the body, his physical body, I live by what? In who? Okay? So we all know it's faith in the Son of God. Let me just give you just some real simple definitions. Faith is a moment-by-moment dependence on God, believing that that only He, as the source, can produce the life that He promises. Would you all buy into that definition of faith? Okay, based on what we've been talking about. How about this one? Faith says that I can't live the Christian life. Since God can and will, I'm going to trust Him to live His life in me. Would you all buy into that definition of faith? Okay. So when people come to me, they say, Bill, remember I want to kind of go back to this couple that were the Aggie engineer, and we were talking about this walk of faith. And you remember what he said? He interrupted me and he said, Bill, I know it's by faith, but what? Just tell me what to do. Now, who was the object of his faith with that statement? He was. So let me tell you what I've discovered is that there are two objects of faith. The question is, who's the object of your faith? Well, let's look at the results of either choice that we make, because we're making a conscious or unconscious choice every moment. Faith in yourself, what's going to be the result? Now see here again, faith in yourself as the source with God's help. A lifeless, powerless, unchanged life. In the marriage conference, I just say a lifeless, powerless, loveless life. That's my last name. That's why I don't title my conferences after my name. Come to the Loveless Marriage Conference. Man, you're going to really, that's quite an advertisement, isn't it? But faith in God as your source is going to eventually produce every single promise that He has. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, who is the true object of our faith? All right, if you believe that it's up to you with God's help to live the Christian life, is it possible that the real object of your faith is your ability, willpower, and self-discipline? This goes back to this learn and do mindset, all right? So why do we struggle with faith? I want to go back to this that we talked about in session 1. Everything about life is learn and do. And here again, you remember my spiritual checklist. Just tell me what to do and I'm going to go do it. So it's a problem with faith because you can learn, but who's going to do the doing? Come on. Who is going to do the doing? He who began a good work in you, who's going to do it? Commit your way to the Lord, trust also in Him, and who's going to do it? He is going to do it. He doesn't tell you to do it because He knows what? You can't do it. And the sooner we agree with God that we can't, the faster this whole process seems to work. But doesn't it make sense that everything in our life is learning to do? This is the biggest stumbling block, because as I was talking to this group of men, they broke into these groups, and these guys were really struggling about, I've got to do something. Tell me what it's going to look like, all these things. Well, here's another problem with faith. We want to bring our intellect, ability, and talents to be part of the cause and effect of our spiritual transformation. And of course, legalism, doesn't that nurture the learn and do Christianity? Here are the things you need to do, and if you do these things, I don't know, everybody within it, we got a little attorney in us, we want the law. There's something within us that wants the law. We want the checklist, we want the formula, because if we can, but think about this. If you could fulfill it, why would you need God? Why would you need God if you could keep the rules, keep the commands? Why would you need God? So let's assume that you keep some of the rules, and if you do, and it's about you, then I call that self-commendation. Look at me. But what if I fail? Then it's self-condemnation. You see, if you're living independent of God, it's either self-commendation because I did it or self-condemnation because I didn't. Or I can look at Samuel and say, he didn't do it, but Bill did. So now we got to condemn Samuel. So legalism just nurtures this. Also, the flesh says, I will put my faith in who? Me. Okay? So, now we get to this question. And because I always get to this part, and people say, Bill, this is so passive. You know, that branch abiding in the vine and being on the surgical table, it seems so passive. Well, the truth is, the Christian life is very active, but who is the source of the activity? Could you think about that just a moment? I can't renew my mind. I could not set myself free from that fear. The thing I hated most was the rejection. And I think Rosemary will appreciate this, I was so rejected I had to leave a football game because they were talking about me in the huddle. Okay, that's how rejected I was. That's a joke, but you get the point, okay? Very hypersensitive to rejection. But as I began to allow the life and power of Christ to work in me, then change began to take place. So God's in you right now. And I'm telling you what, there's a reason why they call it the fight of faith. It is a fight to be dependent. Paul says this. He says, and it's a New Living Translation, it says, I struggle. I work hard depending on the power that works within me. What's his work? Dependence. His work is dependence. We've got to work at it because our default is, I can handle it, fix it, solve it, independent of God. And I just have this, remember the old Nicoderm patches? Stop smoking. Well, that's what God is. We're just going to slap on a little Nicoderm patch and go through life, and I'm sure, slowly but surely, it'll just, by osmosis, somehow change my life. It doesn't work that way. It's the engaging for you, the key word for us is intentionality. We need to be intentional about depending. So, if you all believe that your faith walk is a walk of faith, then we need to ask ourselves some questions. Are you experiencing ongoing victory over your defeating sin patterns? How about freedom from your sinful behaviors? Healing of past woundedness, ongoing transformation to be like Christ. Because isn't this ultimately that goes back to our original question, how is it working for you? Because aren't these promises for us? We've talked about them today. You've read them for years. But are we experiencing it? And is it possible, if we're not, that the object of our faith really, when we and here again, you might pray the prayer of David in Psalm 139, search my heart, O God, see if there be any hurtful way. Look in my heart and see. But if you sit here tonight and say, you know what, Bill, there's really not any ongoing victory or freedom, and there's no real change into Christ-likeness, then I think maybe God's speaking to you and saying, okay, I think you're really trying to live the life. You're really living a life, and I want to be the life in you. So, we'll just end with this. Since I cannot live the life, my part is to depend on God to provide and produce His life in me. Well, let me before I do, let me just tell you about my three guys in this group, and I'll tell you. Remember Dr. Wayne Gordon, the neurologist? I love the way everything was a trophy. His kids, his wife, his house, everything, and yet there was no fulfillment, and he was stressed out. I'll never forget when he came to our first Tuesday meeting. And you can tell he's a handsome guy. I mean, you talk about positive flesh and everything going for him. And he said, man, I just can't beat the stress. And my wife are in distress. We've been in distress. We've had everything the world has to offer, but we have been in great distress. And as he began to understand these truths, because the job he had was a pressure cooker, and so he began to entrust the stress to God and experience Christ's peace. And things began to change in his marriage, and he said he's never had his wife say this in, let's see, how many years of marriage? I want to say 26, 25 or 26, you're my best friend. So God has moved him down this path, and now in his own church, he's an elder teaching these same truths. He just got through teaching book 1 to a group, and I said, what did these truths do in you? He says, Bill, I can't even tell you. That now I realize that in spite of all my ability and all my intellect and all my capability, I'm just like Paul. I cannot live the Christian life, but Christ lives it in me. I remember Felicia, who was really struggling, really tormented, a lot of demonic oppression. She ended up in a psychiatric ward, and boy, she came that close to being sucked into the system, and once you're in the system, you never get out. And it's a very powerful story that I can't even relate quite as good as she can, but God divinely delivered her from this psych hospital, and she came to brokenness. And I wish I could bring her here tonight to give you her testimony. I mean, the amazing changes. God has really set her free from so many of these strongholds and woundedness of her past. And you can look at her face. I mean, this is the after picture. This is who she really is. Amazing story. And then Tim Ecknos, I was sharing with you, my pastor, who I kind of left that story with that, he counseled the whole family, remember? And the counselor said, everybody's fine, but you're the one that's got the real issues. And he realized that he had never forgiven this priest. He had never forgiven his parents because they kind of just brushed it under because he had been molested by this Catholic priest. And he had all this anger that had been pent up. He was taking out all of his kids. He was a get-her-done guy. I remember he was telling me about a story. He was in Vietnam, and everybody was supposed to show up to help build the church and, physically to, build this thing, and nobody shows up. And he says, I just stomped out in the jungle, and I looked at God, and I said, hey, what are you doing here? I mean, you brought me here. I'm here. Where is everybody else? It took God 22 years to break Tim. But the point of freedom is realizing that he had never forgiven this priest. And because of his forgiveness to the priest and his parents, that was the beginning of the transformation. And God continued to break him. Just an amazing story of how God's worked in and through his life. So, any questions? Are we a little ahead of schedule? Can't believe it. Wow. We're going to get to bed fairly early tonight. I'm going to keep you up. So, yes, sir. Okay. You mean as one who is striving for that?
Well, as one who gets angry and upset because it's not right.
Right, perfect. Right. It's interesting. We all have expectations. One of the things I teach in marriage conferences is we have unrealistic expectations of our spouses, and we also have realistic expectations. But if you're, and you don't even have to be a perfectionist to have these bars of expectation, but perfectionist, you see, they're striving to be something they'll never be. You get that? But guess what they also do? They put you under the law, and they set the bar because I'm working to go up to this bar, and now you need to go to that bar, and if you jump over that bar, then I will love you, then I will find you worthy, then you'll be acceptable. And then you know what else a perfectionist says? I'm going to feel much better because you jumped over my bar of expectations. So, perfectionists, God bless you. I'm telling you what, it's a tough one to overcome. But you see, you were born in a fallen body, and you do sin. And here's the thing that we need to understand. It says, we talked about in Colossians 2:9-10, you're complete in Him. So why are we striving for something that's never going to happen experientially? Because what we tend to do is we put ourselves under the law because I've got to keep raising the bar and then I'll be perfect. I mean, if I'm Satan, I love perfectionist. Oh, you got that bar? Okay, let's try this bar. Okay, well, your spouse isn't living up to them, so let's put him or her under that same, law, if you will, of performance. Here again, it's all performance, isn't it? We go back to performance. and you need to jump over these bars. So yeah, perfectionism is a killer because you're setting standards you'll never be able to keep. It's never enough. You know, they ask a famous billionaire, says, you know, what's the thing that you want more than anything because you've gotten everything else? He said, just $1 more. Just one more dollar, that's all I need.
Then is there a difference between perfectionism and excellence?
Well, I think that, you know, God, let's say, you know, it says to do your work heartily as unto the Lord. Well, excellence is, yes, I mean, God does want us to do work excellent, but He also wants me to do it in Him. Because who determines what excellence looks like? Say, you or God. If you determine it, then you've set a bar for yourself, and if you jump over that bar of what you define as excellence, then what do? Right? It's self-commendation. And then if you fail, then it's self-condemnation. You see how we're back into this performance thing? Either I've done well or I've done poorly, but it's not Christ-like. It's simply another form of self. So when I look at the word excellence, if I'm doing tonight, okay, let's just assume this conference. You know, when God is only going to say, well done, good and faithful servant, if I do one thing. And what do you think that one thing is I need to do? Obedience. Well, dependence. That's it. Which is the same thing, but I'm not a big obedience word, you know, because I came from a background where you better obey, Samuel. But so let's use the word dependence. And not that those are not good words, but dependence. He said, Bill, you know, I work with the Tuesday group and these guys, and I love them, but I made a big mistake one day. I said that God spoke through a jackass. And so now every time I go to speak, a guy named Joe Reinigal, who's the Ken 5 sports guy, he says, Bill, will you just be the jackass of choice? So, you know, on the way over here, because this isn't my first rodeo, this isn't the first time I've done this, but God said, Bill, who's going to teach tonight? You got that? Who's going to teach tonight? You or me? Well, what if I said me? Now, here's the thing you need to understand, and this is what gets pastors in trouble too, is that if I came here tonight and I just spoke truth, you know that truth would not return void, even if I did it independent of God. You talk about positive flesh. I came in here and says, God, take the night off. You know, go celebrate with the rest of the Aggies. You know what I mean? Let's just have a good time tonight. All right? You take the night off. I got it from here. And here's the thing. He won't speak through me, but He'll speak to you. You know what that became? If I came here and did this independent of God, it'd be a dead work. It would be. You get it? But see, what is He asking me to do? He's not asking me to teach. What is He asking me to do? Be my hands, be my mouth, be my feet. Let me speak through you. And you know what happens? Every time that happens, I get something. In fact, may get something more for you, for me, these last 4 sessions than you're going to get. Maybe God just brought all of you here so He could teach me something. Thank you. Thank you for coming. I appreciate that. Now, He may speak to you as well, but do you see this word participation? I simply said, Lord, I'm trusting You to speak through me. And Lord, if I say something that's not of You, would You just clean it up between my mouth and their ears? And I believe God can do that because my heart is for Him and my heart is for You. Yes, sir, Mike.
If we speak and live as you have suggested,
okay,
does that not put an emotional governor on man's critique or applause to that individual?
Absolutely.
Because the individual knows from which source he's coming from, that he doesn't have to be offended or bloated up by what other people say or think.
Absolutely. And this is why I go back to pastors. Because if a pastor gives a sermon independent of Christ and somebody comes up and says, Pastor, that was an incredibly life-changing message, what would the pastor be tempted to say in his flesh? Yeah. I think I'll do the same thing next week. You see what I'm saying? And so, but if Mike, well, he's not preaching tomorrow, but you know, when Mike preaches, you're getting the weekend off, aren't you? I'm working to death here, but you know, I'm participating with the life and power of Christ. See how quickly you can slip? And so, yeah, that's right. Well, but you see, it is the life and power. So when I first heard Ian Thomas, that first time I was telling you about, the 84-year-old man, it wasn't just what he was saying, because an unbeliever could have said the words, but what was I experiencing through him? The life and power of Christ. And I'm telling you what, he became very attractive. That's why I stalked him for 4 days, because he was living something I so wanted, but I couldn't understand what it was. So yeah, that by participating with him, and early on, when I would do this, just to be really bluntly honest with you, when I first started and somebody would come up and say, golly, Bill, that was really good, I would say, no, that's simply Jesus. Well, I mean, just false humility, And finally, God said, Bill, just cool it. But He had to take me through this process. But here's one thing that the second thing I would say is, no, it's not me, it's God. And God brought me up short, and He says, no, Bill, it's us. Yeah. It's us. You said yes to me. You were willing to participate. You're not going to steal my glory, but I'm telling you, well done, good and faithful servant. I'm delighted in you. I'm proud of you, but it was me doing it. In who? I wasn't doing it in Bill. Who was I doing it in? Christ. Christ. I'm sorry? He needed a mouth. And like I say, I'm the jackass of choice for your conference, right? Because he did speak through the stones. He can do that. But I'm telling you what, I've done this hundreds of times, and I get just as excited about these truths as if from the first time I taught them back in 2001. Because it's life, folks. These aren't simply words. There's life and power associated with this. Did I get anywhere close to the answer to your question?
Yeah, no.
Okay. I babble on and I'm thinking, okay, did we answer the question? Okay, any other questions or thoughts? Well, this last session, we're going to talk about practical living it out. How do I appropriate this life of Christ? What does that look like in specific situations? Then I want to give you an opportunity too, with maybe a particular characteristic or a question like you ask, is what does that look like in this particular situation? So I want you to be able to jump in, interact, say, Bill, I'm wrestling with this. I don't buy into it. Let's just wrestle this last session.